Next we've got Glenn McDonald from DPERD to come and talk to us about all the things that can go wrong with soil amelioration. Glenn's been working for subsoils for a while now. He's seen many stuff-ups and probably most of them on my farm. Thanks, Glenn.
In terms of a blooper, really it's an embarrassing error. So in farming, it's really an unintended trial. So you just need some old chemical drums and a post and some flagging tape and you've got an instant trial, especially if it's in the front gate. Some of the key things around avoiding bloopers. First up, saying it quite a bit, you really need to start digging some holes and have a looking at your soil. Take soil samples in 10 centimetre increments and get them analysed. While you're digging that hole, looking for rooting structure as well as soil structure. So you don't need to quite go to the depth of this, which is over 1 metre deep, or get some big machinery out. You can get down to a reasonable depth of a shovel and have a look. That's a post-amelioration photo there. So once you've done that, you need to come up with a plan. So once you've got your results, plan what you want to do, how you want the soil to look and behave when you finish, see what other constraints are there as well. Test it, so test your plan, do some strips, or do a little bit, even 50 to 100 metres, what you're trying to do, and then have another look by digging some more holes. Once you're happy with that, effectively to implement what you're doing, different ways in terms of monitoring with test strips. If you're confident of the result, you can pretty well do the whole paddock and just leave a couple of strips untreated. Or if you're not sure of what's going to happen, then just do a couple of strips and leave the rest untreated. By leaving a strip or two untreated, you can then assess over time the longevity of the response. Just some things that we've found out or it's been talked about, and a lot of these photos come from Twitter, but a lot of them also come from research sites and growers that have happily supplied their unintended trials. So this spot here is just a trial, and there's other plots over here where varying rates of herbicide were used post-amelioration. It can show some of the herbicide effects. So a trial that I've been involved with north of town here at Boscobel, basically different amelioration treatments looking at non-wetting amelioration. But the key point here is that in terms of average net return from the control, which is 0, so the increase annually, both the ploughed treatments and one-way plough, mobile plough, around 75 to almost $90 a hectare when there's no herbicides. But just the cost of the herbicide and a slight reduction in yield has dropped the return down. So often after some amelioration treatments, you may not need a herbicide as much or not at a higher rate. So some of the other things that we see is things like if you don't really know your soil profile very well, or you do know it, but you do it anyway. So they've got an acid soil from up north. They've inverted with a mobile plough, so they've buried the lime and topsoil down there, but they've brought up an acid layer into the seeding zone, into the root zone. They've applied some lime post-treatment, but it doesn't look like it's been enough. But then again in another year or in the same year, it might have actually needed some incorporation of that other surface lime as well. So they might have needed a robust rate, possibly coming back with a set of offset discs or something to try and get it into that layer in there as well. Other things we see is when you're trying to do amelioration when the soil moisture content's not right, it's not the best conditions. So an example is moldboarding or spading. If it's too dry, it just flows like water. We can imagine at the beach trying to make a sand castle out of the sand dunes. Doesn't really work because the soil doesn't hold together. So it's a little bit the same when you're spading or moldboarding. So what we're seeing here is that dry, the incorporation has only got to around 30 centimetres in the moldboard, but when it's been a little bit wetter, we've got better inversion of the topsoil and it's gone down to 40, 45 centimetres. Also, if you're ameliorating in the autumn period, the risk of erosion is a lot greater, especially in the sandier soils. So this is the site east of Esperance, where it's been moldboarded in autumn and some of it's blown away. Not always a total loss, even though you've lost some of your topsoil, in that the untreated part was quite weedy, ended up with a relatively clean crop, or that might have had to be re-sown, so there's a bit of a cost there. The other alternative is to plough or de-amelioration later in the season, which is useful if you've got livestock. You can defer graze or graze the area that you're going to ameliorate, spray it out, and then plough or ameliorate. In this case, it was done a bit too late. This grower normally does it in August, September, but they went in October, thinking that would be a good thing to do last year, and it dried off a bit quicker than they thought, and they ended up with big patches where it didn't establish, so they've got an erosion risk in that area there. On a lot of the heavier textured soils, it can be a bit too wet for ripping, so you end up with a knife through butter type scenario. It doesn't get the fracturing of the subsoil. So if you can roll the soil sausage, then it's probably a bit too wet for ripping, and you're not going to get the effect that you want. Alternatively, if it's a bit too dry, your ripping tines won't get in. So this is the experimental ripper, so it's got leading tines, so the leading tines are digging in a little bit, and then the following tines are supposed to be going in a bit deeper, but it's probably only going in about 15 to 20 centimetres there, so it's not really the effect they're after. And also in some of these sodic and dispersant soils, you'll usually end up with clods. So here is these two photos are from the Beacon site, to end up with a cloddy surface. Something a bit closer to home, this is down at Ongerup, where they got depth of around 40 centimetres. They're still, after 4 or 5 years, have got these big large clods, which some of them are pushing 20, 25 centimetres across. So from the Beacon site, in reality, there was not much difference in yield or establishment from the ripping treatments. And when you take into account the cumulative return rate of investment, return on investment, for the 2 years, all the treatments effectively gave us a negative result. So really we lost money on doing those amelioration treatments. So bloopers commonly occur when the treatment is not applicable for all soil types in the paddock. So we see this a lot with paddock variability. So at this site, near Esperance, delving, it has variable depth to clay in the paddock. So delving shallow duplexes, so where the clay was 10 to 60 centimetres deep, it brought up too much clay. It's not really a good thing if it's a sodic, saline and high boron clay. And even after 10 years, so it was delved in 2009, even after 10 years, there's still a significant yield penalty in there. So just to show that it's not really necessarily across the whole paddock, so we've got two zones. So zone 1 here, where it was not delved, is a higher yield than where it was delved, versus zone 2, where the difference between delved and not delved isn't as great. So generally at this site there was, over the years, there's been more of a yield penalty when it's been dry. And in the drier years, there's been a significant reduction in yields. Same site, the return on investment over the 8 years. In reality, no matter which zone it was, even zone 2, which looked like it wasn't decreased yield that much, it still had a reduction in income, which is not really what people want after this sort of thing. So the solution on that site really is bring up less clay or don't dig as deep, so variable depth, which probably wouldn't have been the go with that spader, and I don't think they've done any spading, with that delver, and I don't think they've done any delving since. But they do other things such as spading. They look at things like amelioration by zones using EM maps and gamma radiation maps. But at this site, it didn't really work because of the variability. You get a lot of variability in the site, but also the EM doesn't really work that well with salinity and moisture content changes. So in some ways, it's better to look at NDVI and biomass maps and yield maps over time to give you a better idea. What they've also done is they've started claying the poorer patches in preference to trying to bring clay up. They're just bringing clay in that they know the quality of. And they're also using an improved seeding system which for them is the alpha discs. So moldboard ploughing, especially over these variable soil types, so you've got on duplexes, variable depth, can leave cloddy surfaces, a cloddy surface, and in quite patchy. So this is a site near Ravensthorpe. Reductions in plant establishment, and NDVIs here for the moldboard and spading treatments were significantly lower in establishment, but it did sort of recover to some degree later on, but even they still were lower. Now, the thing about this site is that at the end of the day, there wasn't a lot of difference between the yields over the 2 years between moldboarding, spading, and even off-row seeding compared to the control. But it's where you start to look at the return on investment that you start to have a few more concerns, in that sometimes when there's very little response, you start to run into some negative return on investments. And at that site, even after 7 years, where it's been rolled every year, they had a speed tiller over it in 2017, where they've now got their lumps, the size of the lumps down to about fist size or smaller, but it's still having negative effects in patches in that paddock. So solutions that they've tried, they thought about, again, EM and gamma, but the variability was too great. You got changes over 3 to 4 metres, and ended up with quite a patchwork of soil types. So really what they've been looking at doing is targeting the worst sandy soils and claying them at around 100 tonnes per hectare. They have been doing inter-row sowing. So what that means is that every second year they go back onto the old row from 2 years before. They're trying to preserve the old furrow to allow water to infiltrate better. And I'm not sure if you can see it on that photo there, but the old furrow row here is a lot more damp than the current seed zone. They're also looking at that to get a better distribution of nutrients across the paddock. But now they're looking at disc openers to try and place the new season's crop underneath the previous season. An example from up, I think it was up at Mora. So they've applied no lime. You can just see this darkening, which is the colour indicator of where they've applied lime, but just through incorporation by seeding, it hasn't really moved very far into the profile. So Gauss's Arm's been doing some research on this and looking at how to re-engineer the soil profile and adding lime into different zones of the soil profile. So they scraped off layers, then they applied lime, mixed it in with a rotary hoe, and then backfilled, and then applied lime across that in different treatments, and mixed that into the topsoil. So there's a range of different treatments there just to see how they can vary the incorporation methodologies. So Gauss uses a 360-degree root camera, and these images here are from that camera. So in the control treatment, where they haven't done any amelioration, the roots have really only gone down to around 20 centimetres of depth. Where he's done the deeper tillage, so deeper soil mixing, basically the roots have got down to that 60 centimetre depth that they were digging. But if you added lime into that zone, into that deeper zone, what we've ended up with is there's a lot more fine roots in that deeper layer, around 60 centimetres. So the roots are growing better, more density of roots at that deeper layer. So you would have seen examples of when ploughing and ripping, you can find some rocks, and there's some examples of it I saw in the last couple of years down around Cranbrook as well. You might have seen little rock piles on the side of the road. You can find big rocks. So there's no shortage of these either. So one of the solutions that Tony Murfitt's come up with up at Warrakirri is they section off the paddock based on soil type and other information for zones. So they have a zone when they're ripping, They've got the green zone, where you can happily rip away and listen to whatever tunes and podcasts they've got. But when they hit the purple zone, then they start to pay a bit more attention, monitor the ripper a bit more, maybe even raise it up out of the ground so they're not quite going so deep. The interesting thing here is that they actually have exclusion zones in different parts of the paddock for things like chase bin access and that sort of stuff. Similarly with ploughing, so in a gravel zone as well, so it's a different, you're operating the machine in a different way based on different soil types, so this way they've got some pre-warning of what settings they might want to have on the machine as they go. So, of course, after doing, or mainly ripping, but also ploughing, the soil can be very soft. You can end up making some serious ruts in the soil if you drive over those rip lines or those ploughing areas. So that's where controlled traffic becomes very important. And it can get very soft, especially when it gets wet. Once you break through, especially ripping, some of the guys now up further north are starting to rip almost a metre deep. There's a few people down south are doing it, but even around 60, 70 centimetres, it's a lot of axle height to sink into. So some of the solutions around that, use a roller in deep ripping, seeding with independent depth control, so you don't end up with the seed placement issues you can sometimes get, which we've mentioned a couple of times already this morning. Match your wheel tracks, so use CTF. Leave tracks unripped if you can, and not necessarily just the track, but also a little bit on the side of the track. And sometimes shallow ripping the tracks can help with some of the experience from other areas. And renovate your wheel tracks if they're rutted. And some people do a bit of cross ripping, so ripping across the angle of the wheel tracks, although this may not suit everybody. So generally, conclusions, dig some decent soil pits. You're not using a post hole digger, you're not just getting a spade out and just digging something about 10 to 15 centimetres deep. Dig a decent soil pit into the expected root zone of what you're expecting, or what you want the roots to grow into. Measure and know your soil properties to depths in 10 centimetre increments across the paddock. And ameliorate to the conditions, not to the calendar. A lot of people get into the trap, so we've got the delver or we've got the machine now, we've hired it, we want to use it this week, and it may not necessarily be the best conditions to do the amelioration. If in doubt, leave it out. So if conditions aren't perfect, then often it's better just to hold off and leave it until you get the best opportunity, or you can burn through some dollars that you didn't expect to. One of the other things that Bindi wanted to put in was keep in mind that doubling the load reduces the life of bearings by 10 times, and to check engine oil for signs of wear. So that part of that comes into the stress loads on the transmissions and gearboxes, especially when things like rippers are under high load. It puts quite a bit of shock and pressure on the whole system of the vehicle, of the machines. So just in acknowledgements, there's a number of projects that have contributed to some of this work, as well as quite a few growers that have volunteered their photos and their errors, and also, like I said, a lot of it's come from things like the wider Twitter community. And that's it from me. Happy to take any questions if we've got some time. First hand went up over here.
That Warrakiri one, or whatever it was, that had the rip high tension zone, how are they generating that?
Pretty well it's based on soil maps, just on aerial maps, paddock surveys, ground truthing. A lot of it's done by eye. Some of the work that Ed Oliver has done about trying to map stuff is that when she's mapped it using soil surveys and satellite imagery and all this type of thing, and then taken a blank paddock map to a grower and said, draw me your soil types, they've almost been exactly the same. So a lot of it can be done just through experience.
Has there been any work done just alongside a scarified plot as well, just to see what effect just a bit of tillage does?
Not specifically. There's been a couple of older sites that have compared things like that, of just straight tillage. But you're not going to make much of a change really at that layer. it all depends on what your constraint is and what depth you're playing with. So if you just, you know, if you've got, I don't know, if your topsoil happens to be a lower pH than the subsoil, which can happen, well then maybe that shallow tillage to incorporate a bit of lime into that 10-15 centimetre zone works. Jeremy's got his hand up, so obviously add to that.
It's always a good idea to put a scarifier treatment in. It used to be done back in the 80s when ripping work first started, because sometimes the response is from surface cultivation, and that's it.
Yeah.
Nothing from going deeper.
And that's probably, haven't got it here, but that's probably the response we saw at Scotty Thompson's with the deep ripping site there. We got a stronger response in the first year, which might have been just a mixing response to the deep ripper, and we didn't really see much response after. But also don't think that site was as compacted as what we initially thought.
Southern Dirt's done a trial with it a couple of years back with the deep ripping and moldboarding, which showed results.
Yeah, so with that scarifying aspect, then you've got, which is just the straight tillage versus ripping. If you start looking at then cultivation, then you've got things like, you know, the offset discs or something that a bit more aggressively mixes, like the tiny, with the double disc, the offset discs they go through, is a bit more aggressive in the mixing in that shallower layers. So there are methods to do that, but as a comparison between just the cultivation versus ripping, well then, yeah, it is there. You do get a response from it, but it's there are. I suppose the aspect now is we're starting to rip deeper and deeper in soils that are more responsive. So it's an evolving beast in terms of research.
But it's worth making the point though that the very deep ripping is really only on sand, deep sands, and deep loamy sands that are trying to go deep on clays and gravels that's asking for trouble.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also where knowing your soil profiles comes in and what's the constraints of different layers. You know, the site at Ongrap, deep ripping to 30 centimetres was our best bet. If we went to 40, which got a little bit into that deeper subsoil, then we went backwards. So knowing what depth you're playing with can have a big effect. Yeah.
Glenn, what your trial plots at home?
At your place?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those moldboard plots, first year was 400, and talk about rocks. Second time we did it was 300.
Yeah.
But the beauty of those plots was to walk down and watch the soil profile. Now, my question to you is, what depth is the Plaza player working for a start? So what depth are they trying to work with the Plaza?
Yeah. The Plaza typically gets to around 30, 35. I think that was probably the deepest.
We got down to 40 at Wage and Low.
Yeah, that was really pushing. That was really pushing it onto the ground.
Yeah.
So if I look at our place, the Plaza player is not going to work for a simple reason. A plough never works when it turns to the left. As a youth, I spent my life pulling ploughs. I've actually found a machine that is a multiple row of discs that we can lift one set of discs up and go up and back up with one front set of discs, turn around and come back with the back set of discs.
Yeah, it's a bit like the reversible moldboard.
And yeah, but the trouble is the moldboard, it takes half that football oval to turn around.
Oh, yeah.
And we're talking about in our gravel country where you've got nips and tucks, where you actually need to be working. No good turning left for the plough because it's doing nothing. You can't go up and back with a one-way plough, but this tandem disc has actually got A, it's got jump, and B, we can reconfigure the hydraulics so we can have one lot of discs down at a time, which will enable us to go up and back.
So you mean it's got discs following each other, lift one up?
Tandem disc, one after the other, and reconfigure the hydraulics, and we can use the back set going one way and use the front set going the other way, which gives us a ideal for our system where we can go up and back. Now that's actually, I've stumbled on it on the market, and if I look at the results you've got at home, we don't want to turn it over any more than 230 deep, purely for a non-wetting aspect, because we've got that 60 mil of dry sitting up the top that we want to shift down to the bottom.
Yeah.
So
and that's part of having a plan. So Ray's just saying we've got a plan, we've got this soil type, we've got this profile, got these problems, and this is the plan that we want to make or want to have, and he's finding a solution, an engineering solution to put into practice. So that's basically the whole concept of what the presentation's about, is really come up with that plan, know your profile, know your problems, and come up with solutions and ideas to address them. It's not necessarily up to Ray to come up to all the ideas, he's learning off everyone else, same as we learn off him. So it's a matter of keeping in touch with each other and the researchers and what's going on.
Has there been any work with the Horse Tiger?
I haven't done anything with it myself. The few spots I've seen, it's sort of, the soil type I've seen it in was in a deeper duplex, and it didn't really do that great a job in terms of comparison to a deeper tillage, but that was more to do with that particular soil type. So one of the things I try and tell people is that there's no one machine that will suit every soil type, every condition, or every plan. It's a case of finding the machine that suits your needs and what it does. Things like tine angles make a difference, the way you set up your tines, whether or not you've got wings on the base of ripper tines or not, inclusion plates or not, what depth you're running them at, what speed, moisture content, there's so many variables that come into it. So in terms of the Horse Tiger, it's limited in its depth to what it can go to, but for what it does, in its ideal scenario, yeah, it does a good job. But it's a matter of whether it's the job that you want it to do.